last program saw Daniel extremely afraid as an angel appears to him. The angel is there to tell him what will befall his people, Israel, in the years to come. And he starts out in chapter 11 and verse 1 by saying, "Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him." In other words, Daniel, 4 years ago, when Darius first took over, I was there to help see that he was able to continue. And of course, a big fight's going on behind the scenes between demonic forces of Persia and Michael, and perhaps this angel is Gabriel. We don't know for sure. We're not told explicitly, but we have our suspicions that this is probably also Gabriel. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the fight between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies.
And we're in Daniel chapter 11, and J.R., I like to call chapter 11 Israel in the eye of the hurricane, because if you just imagine whirling winds around Israel, with Israel right in the middle, and it's not a very comfortable thing to be in the eye of the hurricane, because it moves back and forth, and those winds hit you from time to time, coming from different directions. That's exactly what chapter 11 is all about.
And we're not talking about a generation. We're talking about several generations.
Yes, we are. In fact, one could even say it comes down to the present day. Israel is still in the eye of the hurricane even today, and for an appointed time to come.
Now, according to these few verses here, the introductory verses of chapter 11 of Daniel, we have 3 kings in Persia, a 4th far richer than the rest, and then comes the king of Greece, Alexander the Great, in 480 B.C. Do you remember, here's a date, 480 B.C., Gary, and then we've got Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus 4 Epiphanes coming in 168. We're talking several hundred years to hide the hurricane here.
We are indeed. What we have here is a prophecy given by this angel, messenger from heaven to Daniel. "Now I will show you the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. The 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." And what we have here is Cyrus passing away in 529 BC, followed by Ahasuerus. You can read about him in Ezra chapter 4. Followed by Artaxerxes, followed by Darius Hystaspes in 485 BC, and then comes the period just mentioned by J.R., Xerxes in 480 BC. Now, Xerxes was a warlike, super mega ruler of Persia who had it in his head, I am so rich and so expanded that I'm just going to move my empire to the west, and I believe I can go over the Mediterranean and wipe out the Greeks. And J.R., do you remember what happened when Xerxes tried to go wipe out the Greeks?
Yeah, he got wiped out, that's what.
He did indeed. And that's where we start this chapter. And so we find this prophecy stirring up all against the realm of Greece actually gives us a beautiful historical picture of what really happened. And in the wake of his defeat, the Greeks developed a terrible hatred for the Persians. It was a national religion to hate the Persians. After Xerxes attempted to wipe them out, this became all of their war chants and their stories and their histories. I mean, everything was directed toward getting even with the Persians. And so when Alexander the Great came along, son of Philip, that was foremost in his mind, and he did it. And we see him in verse 3, "And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." And that was Alexander the Great going back and taking Persia, exactly as the Greeks wanted him to do.
Unfortunately for Alexander, he died pretty soon.
Yes.
He didn't enjoy his glory very long. His kingdom then was divided into 4 divisions, as we have seen in past studies. The important thing about this are the 2 generals of Alexander who took Seleucus, the northern kingdom of Babylonia, Syria. In fact, his kingdom ran all the way up into Asia to the Hermus Valley and all the way to the east to the Ganges River of India. And he made his throne in Damascus just close enough to where he could really be a thorn in Israel's side, you know.
That's right.
And then there's Ptolemy, who went down to Egypt, and he carried the body of Alexander down, buried it in a tomb on the west side of Egypt at a place where Alexander had resorted earlier and had loved the place, and so Alexander got to be buried in the place he loved.
Now, I think we have here a message to the Jews, specifically the Jews of the latter days, who are, even as we speak, reading this, who will in the weeks, months, years to come, begin to be able to read this as the Spirit gives them understanding, because what we have here is that out of Alexander came the great battle between the Seleucids of the north and the Ptolemies of the south that swept back and forth across Israel until at last the Ptolemies sort of faded away, the Seleucids faded away in yet another way, which we'll discuss in a moment, leaving one man standing tall above all the pages of Scripture, a man of great evil, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was a Seleucid, and he is the man who is the model for the Antichrist. So the reason for chapter 11 is simply to give a dynastic history and bloodline that can be checked by future generations when they are checking on the identity of the Antichrist.
So in these following verses, which we shall just briefly peruse, we're not going to get into the specific details of everything, but we just want to give you a flavor of what went on for those 300 or 400 years. Let's take, for example, in verse 5, the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, the king of the south would be the king of Egypt.
Ptolemy Soter. And he made war against Seleucus Nicator, vice-regent of Babylonia, which by that time was a defunct country. But nevertheless, he was a Seleucid, and he was victorious over Ptolemy Soter. And so the battle begins.
And verse 6, the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north and make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm, but she shall be given up. And they that brought her, they're going to betray her, and she'll die there, won't she?
Yes, indeed. Well, Ptolemy II gave his daughter Bernice to Antiochus Theos of Syria as a marriage pledge. The two children were 7 years old when they were betrothed, and they were married at 12, but both were killed, which set off another round of war-making, by the way, instead of the intended result.
Wow. And verse 7 says, out of a branch of her root shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army and enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against him and shall prevail.
That's Ptolemy Euergetes, Bernice's brother, who absolutely breathed hatred with every breath to get even with the Seleucids, and he came and wreaked havoc upon the north.
And it goes on to say, shall carry away captives to Egypt, unto Egypt their gods, with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return to his own land, but his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and they're going to go back and they're going to fight the other guys, and then those other guys are going to come back and fight them. And it goes on and on and on, verse after verse after verse after verse.
And what happens when you look at this, and if you study it carefully, there's a long study in this. You can actually study dynasties and bloodlines, both of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. But geographically, what's happening is that Israel is right in the middle. The Seleucids are in the north, the Ptolemies are in the south, and they're sweeping back and forth across Israel, and poor Israel gets the brunt of all of this fighting.
So when we come to verse 15, we come to Antiochus the Great, Antiochus the First Epiphanes. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mountain, take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people neither shall there be any more strength to withstand. And he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So Israel's going to really get the brunt of all of this.
And again, Antiochus the Great attempted a marriage with a southern prince. It didn't work. Israel continues to catch it.
And you know, verse 17 says, he shall give him the daughter of women corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. This would be Cleopatra.
Cleopatra.
Not the Cleopatra of Liz Taylor fame, but an earlier, perhaps a grandmother or something of the later Cleopatra. And so there's more fighting and warring back and forth. And then comes verse 20, the raiser of taxes and the glory of the kingdom. We'll get back to that when we return in just a moment. Gary, who is the raiser of taxes?
Verse 20, then shall stand up in his estate or in his dynasty, that's the Seleucids, a raiser of taxes. Well, Seleucus Philopater was a man who followed Antiochus the Great. And it was his lifelong dream to raise a giant army, and he taxed the Jews mercilessly and actually raised a large army, but he died before he could move to the south and make war.
Now we come to verse 21, and Antiochus for Epiphanes, the big guy, the man who in Daniel prefigures the Antichrist. He is the man who went into Israel and sacrificed a pig on the altar in 168. And we'll say more about that as we get along. Let me read verse 21. In his estate shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. Gary, the story is that he tricked the Jewish people into liking him, into worshiping him, and they welcomed him into their city, and he came in with great pomp and ceremony, and suddenly he went into the temple and sacrificed a pig and just committed an abomination so abhorrent that the Jews just recoiled in horror. And he took the golden vessels and the treasures of the temple and carried them back off to Syria, including the golden menorah. And of course, this started the 3-year war with Judas Maccabeus. All that's told in the Maccabees. And Judas Maccabeus finally 3 years later to the day. And this, by the way, was December the 25th. Isn't that amazing?
It is.
So when they came back in, they had to build another menorah. They built it out of lead. They didn't have any gold. But they found 1 day's oil supply. And they put in the oil and lit the lamps anyway. It would take 8 days for another supply. And that 1 day's oil supply burned for 8 days in that menorah made out of lead. And that's where we get Hanukkah.
Absolutely. Now, we have this battle between the Maccabees and Antiochus IV Epiphanes really prefiguring or foreshadowing the events of the latter days. From this point forward, J.R., as we read about the life of Antiochus Epiphanes, we begin to blend his life together with the life of the future Antichrist until finally, when we come to verse 36, where it says, and the king shall do according to his will, we are in the far future.
Yeah.
There is a break at that point. So from here forward, we're talking about not only Antiochus IV Epiphanes, but also the future king. Now, the clear implication is that they are both of the same dynasty and of the same bloodline. That is, somewhere a Seleucid blood is flowing in the offspring of some European royal somewhere who is going to stand up one of these days as the willful king, the man of sin, the Antichrist. And Daniel, it was given to Daniel to tell this story.
You know, Gary, we have European royalty who are presiding over several countries, not just Europe.
That's right.
Some of England's provinces, for example, even the Bahamas, was ruled by an English royalty.
Absolutely.
And our presidents in America, many of them have ties to English royalty.
Also the Canadians and several of the French royals here and there.
Yes.
So they're spread all over the world. No one knows who this could be.
That's right. Now, the interesting thing is, it says in verse 27, "For yet the time shall be yet the end shall be at the time appointed," meaning that we have double talk here about Antiochus for Epiphanes, right, because what is said of him also has a double reference to the end time and the future Antichrist.
In verse 28, "Then shall he return to his land with great riches. His heart shall be against the holy covenant." And there it is. He will pretend to support the covenant. Now, we know what the covenant is, the Abrahamic covenant, which gives the land to the people Israel. But in the end, he's going to turn that covenant upside down, and Israel will have to flee for its life. And you know, we have another time mentioned here in verse 29. "At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or the latter, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him." This is clearly a reference to the world global system, because the ships of Kittim, which we learn in other Old Testament scripture, really refer to the merchants of Tarshish, the global merchants that appear all the way through the Bible, finally coming to their end in the book of Revelation.
We're talking Mystery Babylon here.
Absolutely. Mystery Babylon.
Mystery Babylon's going to come against him.
That's right.
And so there's going to be this kingdom of the Antichrist. It's going to have so much dissension from within that it cannot possibly create utopia on planet Earth. And all of this talk by the United Nations that they're going to produce world government, and all of the glorious promises that are coming. I want you to know there's so much infighting going on, so much fighting among the politicians behind the scenes. They'll never be able to pull it off. It will fall of its own corruption.
Now, J.R., just as an example of what's going on, look at today. We have Oslo and Madrid, so-called peace conferences, which in my opinion are doing nothing but denuding Israel of the power to resist the enemy offensives. And where are those coming from? Oslo, of course, a kingdom of Europe. Madrid, a kingdom of Europe. These kings are doing the same thing that the Seleucid kings did in the old days, pretending to support Israel while at the same time undermining Israel. Nothing has changed in 2,500 years.
Yes. Now, the important thing I want you to see here is that he has a vendetta against the Holy Covenant, so that in verse 31, "And arms shall stand on his part," that is, he's going to fill Jerusalem with an army, "and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." There it is. The Antichrist will commit the abomination of desolation on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Well, that's contested territory to this very day, isn't it?
To this very day. Now, when you get to verse 35, you come to the end of a period. It says, "Some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed." And at that moment in Daniel, there's a gap between verse 35 and 36, and suddenly we're in the future. "And the king shall do according to his own will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation," that is the tribulation, "be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done."
Yes, go on. Read 37.
All right.
This is important. We're talking Antichrist here, and all of this deals with his personality and his motives. Go ahead.
"Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all." And we could go on at great length here.
Let's stop there just to think of what he's going to do. He does not regard the God of his fathers, which I believe to be the God of the rabbis, which means he's going to be of Israelite descent.
Yes.
And yet he's going to be of Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yes.
Descent, and the Seleucid descent, and the Roman descent, and the Caesar's descent. How is he going to get all of this together? It's very simple. He'll be, just like the rabbi said, 150 years BC. He's going to be from the tribe of Dan. In case you're wondering why Dan's missing from Revelation chapter 7. So when he does not regard the God of his fathers, I think it means that he's of the tribe of Dan. The lost tribe, by the way. And we're going to be looking at this and chapter 12 on our next program, so don't miss it. We're winding up here on Daniel.